started my career as a software developer and then moved into a software architect role. And I know many people have, I think including you, have already said that I gave myself that title. And then, I've kind of progressed into, application architect and enterprise architect and chief architect. So I've kind of seen the different roles, and yes, we can debate, and that's what the whole series that I'll talk about in a minute is, that debate about roles and the profession and so on. But yeah, and Simon talks about fantastic, right? And I think you and I can probably agree. We've done all the types of diagrams that Simon was just showing, and and in fact, my presentation, I haven't got many slides, but there are a couple of diagrams, and I'm sure if Simon's still on, he'll probably be cringing at various points at the pictures. But anyway, no, I think yeah, there's definitely these different perspectives, and we'll certainly get into that for sure. So yeah, all right. So I'll take over the reins. Can you see my slide share? Can you see that coming through? Okay.
Yeah, you're all good to go.
Excellent, great stuff. Well, look, and also I should say I am really pleased to be joined by Steve Blankenship. But I'll kick off with a presentation, then Steve and I will we'll do it one-to-one. But actually, before I go on to a couple of slides, let's do some intros for those that don't know us. So I'm really pleased to be invited back again for the 4th time to the BIL-T series. It's a fantastic conference. I really enjoy watching and being involved in the series. And my role is to build, I work for a software company called Tanium, and my role is very much to build a community of IT strategists and architects globally. And so, yeah, a large part of that is running Architect Tomorrow, and I'll come on to what that is in a moment. But I'm really pleased to be joined by Steve Blankenship from Salisbury University. Steve, perhaps you could just give us a little bit of an overview about your role at Salisbury.
Sure. I've been with Salisbury University for the last 23 years. Various roles, came up through the trenches, spent my time as a system administrator and engineer and architect and DBA, you name it, until they finally had enough of me, maybe management. And then I've been a director for the last 8 years. So
brilliant, thanks, Steve. And so yeah, I talked about the mashup series just now with Paul, and that's very much what this slide here is all about. So what we decided to do was strengthen our relationship with Iasa and some other podcasts which I've been sort of on the periphery of. And so we have this mashup series bringing together these podcasts. It's really exciting. So we've got business architecture in there with Wendy Keane. We've got the consulting angle with Chris Lockhart from Consultant Saying Things. We of course have Paul, who we were just chatting with, who runs the argument for Iasa, and we have Phil Yanov, who runs Tech After 5. So we've got various different perspectives on the architecture and technology industry. And it's, we had the first episode we recorded last month, and that's got really good reaction. And looking forward to recording the next one with Paul tomorrow, as he just said. So I guess I'd be remiss of me not to sort of remind everyone where Architect Tomorrow lives. So there is a YouTube channel called Architect Tomorrow that you can go and find not only the mashup series, but a whole bunch of really interesting discussions with people. And actually the next slide is just a quick kind of snapshot of some of the screen grabs of some of the videos. We've covered a whole bunch of different things. As Paul just mentioned, we were just talking about enterprise architecture, how effective is it these days, and trying to kind of close down the debate on the kind of professionalization of enterprise architecture, but that's going to rumble on for some time to come, I'm sure, until we get some legislation or some more agreement on the roles. Tech and business trends came up recently as well, so that's a relatively new video, but you can find a whole bunch of different videos. We've got about 70 different videos on different topics, and we always talk to either an architect strategist or someone in an adjacent stakeholder kind of role to give a perspective on the topic. So if you've not checked that out, by all means, please do go and check it out. So the main agenda item today, taming software complexity, and this kind of follow on from what Simon was saying around software architecture. I think what I wanted to kind of make clear is Steve and I will touch on software architecture, but I think we're mainly going to talk about what people would agree is kind of application architecture, right? So and that is how often organizations kind of acquire new applications, point solutions, and how that can kind of build up into, some people call it emergent architecture. I sometimes call it accidental architecture if it's kind of not done on purpose, and the duplication and diversity that you get, and crucially the risks that hide in that complexity, and how to kind of get on top of that. And that's very much what Steve and I are going to talk about towards the back half of this conversation now. But let me just sort of explain a few concepts that I've seen in my career. So when I talk to customers, often there's this concept of unnecessary complexity versus necessary complexity. And I think, as an example, I just quickly went and searched for a really messy application landscape picture. And this is the marketing application landscape as of fairly recently. And I guess this is ultimately what could happen if you allowed a very large organization to go out and acquire different marketing tools, right? Marketing applications. You could end up with just hundreds and hundreds of different applications overlapping, doing the same thing. And I think many of my customers I talk to say, well, that's unnecessary complexity, right? If we did a bit more upfront design and more upfront thinking about what applications need, to fit what capabilities, we would perhaps have a simpler landscape and a simpler picture. But of course, with lines of businesses and end users getting more control and more say over their own applications, bring your own application as well as bring your own device. Of course, some of this isn't as simple as just sort of mandating and governing what applications are out there. And Steve and I will of course touch on this, because I know Steve, when you and I were talking before this, there's very much kind of a discussion around what are managed applications and what are unmanaged. So we'll park that for now and definitely come back to that. The next view I wanted to show you is actually a piece of work, a diagram that actually we came up with as the Architect EMEA community, I'm really excited to say. And this it's still not finished, we're still evolving it, but we got loads of great feedback on this. And essentially what this is an attempt to map out pretty much every single type of application or type of asset, I suppose, technology asset that a large complex organization would have. Everything from end user applications and things like that at the top, going down towards, as you go down through this diagram, more kind of the tin, the infrastructure, the wiring, the networking. And it just designed really just to kind of illustrate all the different sort of capabilities you need now to run a modern digital, technologically advanced organization. But this is an example of necessary complexity, right? These are different capabilities. You need a solution for many of these. And actually, this is an example of what my customers often say is necessary complexity, because you've got different capabilities, you need different solutions for different purposes. And as long as you've kind of made sensible choices and rationalized where it's sensible to rationalize, actually, if you have lots of applications, but they're doing different things, that is acceptable. And that's kind of, that's what you need to run, a modern business. Just finally, last couple of slides. Last time I came, those of you who were on last time will remember I showed this picture, this kind of accidental point solution architecture picture, particularly for IT operations, risk and security sort of applications. And kind of as this builds, kind of shows how this accidental architecture can create a real mess of different point solutions, and create a high cost because you're essentially burdening machines with the same kind of capability, and burdening network traffic because you're essentially copying the same data around, and it creates distrust and it creates silos. And so I kind of built this picture, but similar sort of story when you move into risk and compliance. You want data off of endpoints, you want data off of the different systems that are out there, and you start duplicating these data flows. And again, the same often comes with security. So, and why does this happen? Well, it happens because there is a problem, and someone says, well, the answer to this problem is to buy another piece of software. And this is what I mean by this sort of application architecture complexity rather than the individual software architecture, which I know Simon and others have been talking about. And that's important. And I spent the early part of my career on that software engineering problem. But I think it's important not to overlook the the kind of bigger picture application architecture piece as well in all of this. So, and then finally, this is just our this is our kind of view of the world. When you move to platforms and you integrate those platforms smartly, you minimize the amount of connections that are needed, minimize the integration architecture, you rationalize that estate down to strategic platforms. And I think it's fair to say now lines of business have kind of got that. I mean, like the marketing applications picture I was showing you earlier is an interesting example of where, you can go and buy lots of point solutions, or you can go out and buy some strategic marketing platforms and ERP platforms and CRM platforms and integrate those, rather than spending lots of time and energy, integrating lots of different point solutions. So, and of course, different organizations have different philosophies on best of breed versus best of suite and all that sort of stuff. But ultimately, I think a lot of organizations now are landing on this point where they think platforms are the way to go, because it reduces complexity and it allows for greater efficiency to be derived out of that time you're spending on technology. So, with all of that, what I'd love to do now is have a discussion with Steve about a number of the things that we've we've touched on there, but go into a bit more detail with examples from Salisbury. So let me just stop sharing, because it's now about a conversation really between Steve and I. So let me just remember how to do that. Stop sharing screen. Here we go. So that should be gone. And so, Steve, before actually we get into software complexity even, I think it's worth sort of painting a picture for us of the overall complexity that running a university entails, right? I mean, it's been over 20 years since I was a student, and I think the world was a lot simpler back then when the internet was in its early days. But paint us a bit of a picture of how things are now with, running a modern university.
So higher education is a lot of fun. I've been in higher ed my whole career. It's also been over 20 years for me since I was a student, unfortunately. The white hairs are definitely growing. The biggest thing that makes higher ed different than other verticals is the concept of academic freedom. And you talk about the complexity in an environment. Nothing makes an environment more complex than faculty and students having academic freedom. And what that means really is the ability to pursue knowledge wherever it'll lead, whatever it brings. And in effect, what it means is faculty want to be able to install whatever they want to install, get whatever point solutions they want. And a lot of times they have very unique needs. And that unique need might affect 3 people out of 10,000. And unlike a business, those needs can be very, I'd say, out there. I think I told you, I've told you before that we really can't stop most people doing most things, and we just try to put up as many safety guardrails around it as we can. Also, the faculty in higher ed, there's also the concept of tenure. I've got 500 full-time faculty bosses, and they know they have tenure. They know they're pretty much unfireable, and they know they have academic freedom to fall back on. So, something that might be simple and easy to dictate or set with a policy or procedure in a business world takes a lot more effort from a governance standpoint and a design standpoint to bring people around on in a higher ed world. And it's much more involved. Common sense things from a security perspective that we take for granted. So that's the challenge of higher education. The other challenge is you've got the captive population of students who are a very untrustworthy, from a security standpoint perspective, right. Not from a person. They're 18-year-olds. Their frontal cortexes aren't fully developed. So they don't always make the best decisions. Right. And they're very curious and out there. And I know we're going to get into that a little bit later. But those are some of the unique things that really touch on what higher ed brings to the table that a business doesn't.
And you were telling me also about the computer science faculty you have and some of the GPU research. I mean, that's clearly quite high-end stuff. So how do you kind of handle that sort of things as well?
So some of the guardrails that we put up, we have to allow them to do what they're doing. They're bringing in millions of dollars in grants and research, and the kids are here for that educational opportunity to learn those things. So if you want to stand up a whole lab of Linux computers in a high-performance computing environment and do research on GPUs, we need to make that happen. Even when that violates everything with our audit and security standards, what we end up having to do is create a lot of micro-segmentation within our network and within our environment to allow them to exist while still controlling and preventing the spread of terrible things outside of their little pockets within our wider environment. And it definitely adds a lot of challenges, and those are just some of the examples of things that have to get isolated off.
And I guess you have legacy equipment as well, right? So you have sort of different challenges around sort of modern devices and I guess stuff that's in the R&D space as well, right? So.
Oh yeah, I think every industry has a lot of legacy challenges with software. Sometimes our software legacy challenges also bleed over into the physical world, though, in higher ed. For instance, we might have a electron microscope that costs more than my life, that was bought with a grant in 2003,
Yeah.
and is only compatible with a 16-bit version of Windows XP. And you know what? There's no grant to replace that. There's no you've got to deal with that challenge.
I mean, that's the kind of reality, isn't it? That I suppose a lot of the technology industry sort of likes to pretend doesn't exist, right? Oh, everyone should be on the latest and greatest, and yeah. But you were also telling me that with the campus network, you're effectively an ISP as well, aren't you?
Yeah. So about half of our population, we've got roughly 8,500 students, and on campus, about half of our students choose to live directly on our campus in dorms, or residence halls, as the modern terminology is. And those kids, and I say kids, they're all adults. The students, they expect a level of service from us like what you would get from Comcast or whoever your local ISP
Right.
that you have of choice is. Hopefully we provide a better level of service than them. So we're not allowed to get into the middle of that. And part of that is we become a carrier level of operator for a large chunk of our environment, where we're not really allowed to dictate. We're not really allowed to protect them to a certain extent. And any protection that we do, we have to be very careful not to impinge on their personal freedoms.
Yeah.
Because that's their home. So we are their home internet provider too, and they're inside our network, and that can be terrifying. And we go through a lot of steps to isolate them. Again, our network ends up being a ton of bubbles, lots of little bubbles, and then all those interconnected dependencies, and trying to manage all those relationships between all of the different isolated networks that aren't allowed to associate with each other, or are only allowed to associate in certain pre-agreed upon methods. We have to treat students in our dorms as though they were off-campus external users. They really shouldn't be able to do anything that a person on the internet couldn't do.
So it's a pretty less, well, not necessarily less, but complex and diverse environment, right? And I guess I think the thing for me, that the reason that we came together is because I think you've kind of seen that there's a different way of managing this complexity than just trying to do it manually, right? And try and cobble together various different point solutions to kind of get to this. But so there's kind of an irony I always talk about that many probably would have heard before, which is that we're just not using technology to manage technology effectively, because we either have a feast or famine thing, right? We either have like feast, we have loads of different point solutions, sort of seeing little bits of the problem, or we have famine, we have like no technology and we're running around with a clipboard or a spreadsheet or what have you. So I think it's really interesting how you've sort of tackled some of these challenges at Salisbury. So before we kind of get into kind of how you work with Tanium, but how do you kind of manage this sort of relationship with the complexity and sort of managing costs? How do you prioritize in a world where there's only a finite amount of your team and resources to kind of bring to bear? So how do you kind of how do you get on top of that?
Well, it's impossible to prioritize anything or to manage the limited resources that you've got, which are time and money, without the appropriate data to make those decisions off of.
Yeah.
And you can't. The answer is you can't prioritize without data, and you can't get data without the visibility into your environment and the understanding of your environment. And that is one of the main things that Tanium really brought to us, is that increased visibility and understanding of our environment, especially when it relates to endpoints, but also on our servers. So we can't, I can't emphasize enough how important that is to us. And having that client on every endpoint, and I've been hurt before. I've been down these roads, and I've bought a lot of things in my time in IT, but nothing else that we've used has given us that level of visibility with the low level of complexity of accessing the data. I can have people that don't know programming languages, that don't know scripting, that don't know SQL querying. They ask conversational questions to Tanium, and it can return and suggest data to return in almost like a Google-esque format. People that are allergic to almost any other tool I've tried to give them, they can ask conversational questions to Tanium and immediately get feedback back. Whereas other things I've used, it takes someone who can query a database, hope that that attribute is cataloged and indexed, hope that it got pulled in, that we had that WMI indicator already defined, that we had it in SCCM or whatever tool we've used previously. And then even once they get that data back, working with that data, that's the next challenge. So they find out, they ask a question of the environment, but then taking that question and pivoting that question into an action is the next thing that's magical to us, because everything's actionable through that GUI without deep knowledge. So straight from that question, I can feed the question results into a deployment, into another question, into a report or a dashboard. I can visualize all this information all through a web GUI with just such a lower activation cost. So much lower.
It's interesting, right? I think many people have kind of given up, like that they can get a handle on the as-is estate. It's just too hard, right? And so it's always refreshing when I have conversations with you and others who have kind of got it, that it needs to be data driven, it needs to be insights driven, and actually this stuff can be queried like Google, as long as you have the right sort of platform and kind of integrated sort of approach to getting that data. And the other thing I was really fascinated when we were talking before this talk was the kind of concept you have to have around the applications you actively manage and the ones you don't. And I know you touched on this a little bit earlier, but perhaps talk a little bit about that, because I think this talks to the whole heart of this kind of complex application software complexity piece, right?
Yeah, so we make a big distinction between applications that we manage and curate, I guess is a better word for it, versus applications in the wild.
Yeah.
And we effectively try to curate maybe around 300 or so applications where we control the versioning of, we make sure it's distributed to the appropriate people, control the licensing or access of, and put it through a method in which users can self-service and all of that. The full suite of, our service offering of, hey, these applications we endorse, we support, we encourage you to have, or we support the licensing thereof. Then you get into the thousands of other applications that exist on our network that you have no knowledge of, no visibility of. It's really mind-numbing when you pulled up the slide before of the different verticals of just marketing software. I feel like that's a picture of our environment. It's just it's a hodgepodge of applications you've never heard of, because we let people, we have to give them that freedom. We have to let them follow all these different paths, and it's too much for any one person to manage. And we don't even know what exists, or we didn't even know what exists out there. And the challenge with that is, if you don't know what exists in your environment, you can't adequately secure it. You can't adequately help those users. And that's why I come back to data being the most essential piece of this, and that visibility is truly what's magical. I couldn't have answered these questions before.
Yeah.
So when we get those notices, or I get the vulnerability alerts, CVEs, and I go, well, I hope I don't have that. I don't think I have that. Well, now I can ask. I can know right away. I can type it in, and it'll help me fill in the question I was trying to ask.
Yeah.
And then it'll give it back to me, even though I've never worked with that application before. I don't know how to how to iterate enough how important that visibility is in our day-to-day lives.
Well, it comes back, I suppose, to the old saying, you can't manage what you can't measure, right? And
yep.
And I think I'll go back to the irony, right? It's the irony that many organizations just don't have data on their technology. Like, yet we provide data to lines of business units. You provide solutions that provide data on research findings or student numbers or whatever. We provide that line of business or line of service type data, and we do our best to deliver that. Yet when it comes to our own assets, we're like, oh, what do we do here? Oh, well, there's something over here and something over there. So it's kind of better way for me. That's why I kind of say it's one of the greatest ironies in technology, because everyone is so busy delivering the end product they've almost forgotten about the foundations that end product is kind of built on. And the next thing I was going to kind of talk to you about was kind of the security challenge, right? This complexity. There's so much risk in this complexity, isn't there? Because if you can't say, which you clearly can't in your case, if you can't say, right, you can only run applications that we approve and we pen test and we do this, that, and the other, we're going to lock the environment down, which, let's face it, most organizations now aren't able to do, right? It's if you want to innovate and you want to compete in a fast moving environment, you need to allow, if it's not academic freedom, it's line of business unit freedom, right? You go and choose the marketing tool or the CRM tool that you need in order to do the most effective work that you're going to do in your industry. And so you've kind of got to accept that diversity and start managing the diversity, right? And I was talking about the security piece, and I think for me, this is where it goes from being a risk to being an issue overnight, right? It's like all this software you don't know you've got all of a sudden becomes this like completely unknown, right? It's like, do I have that, and how much do I have it? And so talk to us a little bit about, and we didn't put this in the headline of the talk because it's been done to death, right? But the log4shell thing, I think for many people was like scary. It's like, where is this Java library in my environment? It's like trying to look in a library of books and try and find a particular phrase in each individual book. Like, that's the sort of scale of the problem, right? So talk to us a little bit about how you managed to get on top of that at Salisbury.
Yeah, and I don't want to drive off half your audience, who can groan and say, oh, log4j, I'm sick of that. But if people don't understand about log4j, ultimately, if you have these libraries that are used by millions of pieces of software, oftentimes by developers that don't even know they're using it. If it exists on your computer, you're vulnerable to it. You're vulnerable to those exploits, which the worst of them are remotely executable, and that's terrifying. And it was the highest level vulnerability, from
like
a
10 out of 10, right?
10 out of 10. And when it came out over that weekend before Christmas, we had fortunately already been using. There's one of the pieces of Tanium's called Reveal, and what Reveal does is it's allowed to look through all the files that exist on our computers inside of archives, inside of all sorts of different file types, even files within files within files. And it's a tool that we've used extensively at SU to identify PII, so credit cards and social security numbers. And we have been using that to great effect to identify PII sitting on all of our endpoints and servers. And we automatically remove it. And we leave a little file that says, hey, we took your PII. You're not allowed to keep PII here. This is not an approved repository.
Right.
Contact IT if you need to be re-educated about this, or if you want your file back scrubbed. So anyway, we have been extensively using Reveal. So when it comes out that, hey, this log4j vulnerability, we need to look for this file, and this file might be inside of different library, inside of compressed files, inside of other libraries, and it was a daunting task. But then we realized, no, we're going to look for file patterns with this tool that we've already got, that we already knew how to use, that was already on all of our endpoints and servers. And we found log4j sitting in way more of our environment than we would have thought, especially with those initial releases that came out, where we might have thought, oh, well, this is just maybe an Apache problem, or this is just maybe a insert vendor here or software here. No, this was a really widespread problem, and we were able to immediately see where it existed in our environment, so we can make better decisions, again, about what we needed to do to isolate and protect ourselves from them. And then start to build out that list of all the different vendors we needed to work with to remediate it. Effectively, immediately put in any layers that we can, through, intrusion prevention, firewalls, and endpoint EDR software, and put in all the layers that we can to protect ourselves immediately, and then build out that plan to address it systematically, working with each vendor as we go along, which we're still doing with some vendors that don't believe us they use it. So
it's quite something, isn't it, when you're essentially telling software vendors what's inside their software. And this comes back to the point about software complexity, right? It's like when that's the case, you know that we've lost control over the complexity of software, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, we work with software vendors, everything from what I assume must be 3 kids in their garage, all the way up to Oracle and Microsoft, and we found it all across the board. And I'll tell you, every vendor across that board, even Oracle is still releasing new things for us this week that we had to apply. Um, and the vendors with the lowest level of capability to deal with these things, they're using a lot of these tools off the shelf, and they're slapping it in without full understanding of what they're using. And that's the beauty of intelligent software design and being able to use things off the shelf. But it's such an inherent risk when one of those. I have a great cartoon. I wish I'd sent it to you before. A great cartoon of this incredibly complex machine, and all the way down little bottom right corner, there's a tiny little peg, and there's an arrow pointer that says, "This thing written by a man in Nebraska in 2003 that is supporting the whole structure above it." It's like an IXCD cartoon.
Yeah, I think I remember I think I know the one you're talking about. Yeah.
Or XKCD, sorry, XKCD is a cartoon, and it's great. And it sums up this whole problem to us, and it's gonna keep happening. I don't know if I'm allowed to. Never mind. I refer to Log4j as the gift that's going to keep on giving.
Right.
Because even after we've gone through our environment with a fine-tooth comb and we think we've addressed all the situations, we think we've patched everything, removed it, we've got our environment clean. Well, then we download another upgrade for another piece of software, and it's back in there. So if we don't have something real-time monitoring, looking for this, telling us when it keeps coming back, and our other tools like Nessus and other point solutions that we use for vulnerability scanning, they're not telling us this. They don't have that insight in, so they aren't able to. It's going to keep coming back for years to come. Not to harsh on any other product, but Tanium happens to be uniquely situated on all of our endpoints and all of our servers, and have this particular skill set in their platform to look within files and then act and remediate off of that information, which that's, as I said before, that's magical to me.
I mean, it's funny because that's what a lot of customers say, like, and this is why the challenge we often have is that people think we're selling snake oil because it just seems too good to be true, right? But when you're ultimately sitting on each machine and you're able to see what's on that machine from a running processes point of view, from applications are installed, from logged in users, from any question you want to ask a machine, like you said earlier, it's effectively like Google on every single endpoint. But the reason we make it clever, go back to software engineering and software complexity, what we've done really is we've displaced the complexity of, because you can never really get rid of complexity, all you can do is move it somewhere else. What is incredibly complex is the agent, and it was developed over 5 years of like R&D, right, to refine it down to the most minimal lightweight agent that we could create, and then make the network traffic as lightweight as possible. Because if any of this stuff was heavy, it wouldn't work, right? Because it's a truly decentralized software architecture. So what we've essentially done is, right, let's make complexity part of the solution. Let's distribute the solution out to all the endpoints, but do that in a way that's so lightweight that no one should really notice the impact on their individual endpoints. So it's kind of this really interesting. This is one of the reasons why I joined the company, is because the sheer beauty of pushing out that workload to the edge, if you like, rather than copying all the data and crunching it centrally. I mean, I think this whole big data thing, I think for some use cases, don't get me wrong, it's the right answer. But for other ones, it's like, why are you copying all this? You're just creating a big problem. You're clogging up the network with all this data. And do you even need that data? Wait until you actually have a specific question to go and ask. So, yeah, I mean, that's the really, really cool thing. I mean, this isn't a sales pitch, but I mean, I know people might feel like it is. But this is really us sort of talking about the realities of today's world, where, I mean, we were talking before, the days of waterfall are numbered in most cases. I mean, some organizations still use it for perhaps mission critical nuclear reactor type systems, right? But the reality for most organizations today is not only is their software complex, but their deployment mechanisms are complex, and they're happening like hundreds of times a day. Like, you're doing deployments, multiple times a day. And in your case, you've got this massive complexity and diversity of different users doing different things. and to expect that you can manage that by kind of hopes and, you know, best wishes, you know, without data, is kind of staggering, right? But I go back to the point that, like, people just don't really get that it's possible to do it electronically and systematically. But for me, if you aren't on top of the, you know, what is really going on in my environment sort of challenge, you have essentially got all these kind of, you know, risks hiding in that complexity, right? So so yeah, I mean, I want to go back to the PII piece, because that was really interesting. That's a really interesting point. So, you know, again, I think a lot of people focus on data loss prevention, right? And I don't want to knock data loss prevention; it's got its place. But the challenge, I think, with it is that it's often you know, known file types, or it's specific document types, or it's, you know, specific files, and it's, you know, it relies on classifying the information, right? So talk a little bit about how you've kind of gone out and found PII, because it's very different to DLP, right? It's a different approach.
Oh yeah. So DLP, we've had DLP tools before, and actually the predecessor to what we're doing today was a DLP tool. And my frustration with that is, as a data loss prevention tool, it cares about the exfiltration of your data. And my concern with that is a lot of the exfiltration of data occurs because it's sitting on devices that were unsecured in the first place, that had no business having that CSV of socials that someone ran a report in 2008, and it's copied along with their profile for the last 12 years, 14 years, time flies. You know, that's the situation that exists in people's environments, is people have PII all over their computers and they don't know. And rather than trying to stop it leaving, we wanted to stop it existing. And our actual guidelines from our legislators is that we're not allowed to have PII exist anywhere other than approved encrypted repositories. So we have to define the locations that PII is allowed to exist in our environment, and then we're held to a higher standard for those repositories. So we also try to focus our efforts, because security, again, it's a limited resource. Our time and money, we need to spend that time and money where it's going to get the most bang for our buck. So if we're trying to defend a surface area of 4,000 endpoints, that's impossible. You know, eventually one of those 4,000 endpoints is going to be compromised, guaranteed. You know, which one today? But if I can make sure that those 4,000 endpoints don't have anything on them more than, you know, someone's dissertation, that's the value. I want to limit the exposure that we're going to get and the consequences that'll come from that eventual breach of any individual point of contact. So we had this requirement, we had DLP tools, we tried to tell auditors, well, we stop at leaving, we think, maybe, we really try, and that's not good enough. So we bought other things to try to scan our endpoints, and the amount of labor involved in them, we never even got them implemented off the ground. Different point solutions to attempt to identify on endpoints, you know, where's our social sitting? Where are our credit cards sitting? Where's account information? And the speed at which they would return results, you know, I'd run a scan and it'd take a month for it to tell me anything. And it would never finish on endpoints, or it would never, you know, we got maybe half visibility, I would say, into our environment at best. And then the ability to automatically take action off that data. I don't have the people to call 4,000 users about their endpoints and to have individual conversations with each one of them. So one of our criteria that we had was we needed a tool that would be able to also automatically remediate those endpoints. And that's the magic here. I keep saying that, but we were able to take it and immediately, because essentially we're asking a question of that endpoint, does something that looks like a social exist? We have pattern matching that we then confirm those patterns, and we have to go through and say, yes, this was a valid hit, or no, this wasn't a valid hit. And in all situations like it, those are valid hits. From that point on, we take all of those valid confirmed entries and they're automatically removed. And my administrative effort at that point goes to nothing. Right. So we front loaded the effort of training the program for our environment. We spent about an hour a week for, I'd say, 3 to 4 months, where we would go in there every week as a group, evaluate, train it, no, these aren't real. Yes, these are real. And now we're at a point where I feel pretty good that our users aren't riddled with socials all over their endpoints. And it's not always the people that you think. It's not always the HR administrators and the registrars and the financial people. It's the art secretary that's kept 23 years of contracts on their desktop because they don't like to use, they like to just go into Word and pull up the last one and replace the name. You know, they just like to have them all. and HR goes, you shouldn't hold on to those. And who's stopping them?
It's kind of helping people to help themselves, right? And I really like what you're talking about here, because going back to the complexity, theme and taming complexity, the answer is, of course, again, use technology, use automation to fight that complexity. But going back to the software topic,
to fight it. There aren't enough people in the world. We certainly don't have enough employees to fight it. So everything's got to, as much as can be automated and driven with intelligent design, the better we are. And that's why it was a requirement, and that's the justification we actually were able to use to get Tanium in particular into our environment, is as a security tool, which a lot of people didn't realize. They look at it as more of an operational tool and a very powerful administrative tool to manage endpoints and configuration, but we brought it as a security tool.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. In my world, I see it just as a continuum, right? Managing the complexity and the IT hygiene, kind of getting on top of that drives good security. And I think people are sometimes too keen to kind of put things in boxes and go, oh, that's a piece of security software, or that's an operational piece of software. But talking of software, I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about the kind of managed and unmanaged applications. Talk to us a little bit about perhaps how Tanium helps with that sort of complexity when it comes to software deployment.
So the reason why there's 300 managed applications and not 500 managed applications or 700 managed applications or 1,000 managed applications is the amount of that activation energy for it to become a curated or managed application. Again, there is not enough time in the day, and even those 300, I would say there's varying degrees to which we do maintain. I got apparently a train going by outdoors. Again, I don't have that many people. I got 2 people that manage those applications, amongst other things. And we have, for full disclosure, we've not finished moving our catalog over. But one of the things that I'm looking forward to is being able to do more with less with administering those applications. The activation energy of us packaging up a new version, of us deploying that new version, of us knowing whether that software made it out there. We're not able to do more because of currently with the existing tools that we've been using for the last 15 plus years. I can't. But with Tanium, it's a GUI, and it's legitimately a GUI. It's not the hodgepodge of PowerShell that we currently do, to PowerShells wrapped in PowerShells to push out a piece of software and hope that it made it eventually when we don't really know for sure. That's insane. And we were happy with that. We were happy with the hurry up and wait model of, well, we sent it out and it'll get there eventually, we hope. It won't tell us whether it finished or not, but because that's not really its job, is it?
The sort of hope and pray sort of.
Hope and pray. Spray and pray like the military. We spread it all out there and hope enough of them land. So and that's exhausting.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the military, actually, because that's a customer I can also talk about, right? I mean, we're in the US military, and I think one of the things we were famous for in the Air Force was taking them from a 6-week patch sort of cycle down to a 43-minute patch cycle across a million. I think it was over 1 million endpoints, right? So again, really, really complex environment. Slightly more endpoints than you. I know you have thousands, but this thing scales regardless of if it's thousands or millions, right? Because again, comes back to software engineering and spending the time solving the problem in a scalable, decentralized kind of way. I'm just going to check with Roman whether we have kind of questions coming through at this point for Steve or I on the topic of kind of application complexity. Roman, anything coming through or anything you want to ask?
Well, you know, we have a few, and before I do that, though, I do want to let you two know that I very much appreciate Steve and his professionalism as a part-time faculty member and researcher at a university here in the States. I think you were very good at outlining the problem that we create for you.
Well, I am also a part-time faculty member, and I love working in higher education. The great thing is it keeps you young, keeps you exposed to students and new ideas and new concepts, and you're constantly challenged. And I love getting in front of that classroom too. I can't resist it.
All right.
It's great.
So I did have some things I was hoping you'd talk about. The situation that you have in a university is not really that much different from businesses that have R&D labs or that have innovation teams running around. I used to run an innovation team for a large insurance company, and every time I would run to the CISO's office saying, "What do you think? Can I start a blockchain server today? Can I, whatever?" And by the time, he saw me coming down the hallway, he would sometimes turn around and run the other way. Yeah. But I was trying to be as open and transparent as we could be. Okay. Can you talk a little bit about how you work with your teams to try and generate some of that transparency, rather than governance, which is a big word in education as well?
Well, governance is a big word, but I'll tell you a lot of what we do, we're still a small enough institution that we only have about 450 or so full-time faculty members, and then about 200 or 300 part-time faculty members. The relationship building and design work of meeting with people as people, finding out what they're trying to do, what their goals are, and what the challenges they're facing, and having those human interactions to do to build out a solution that will work for them, get them what they need, while you also are able to relay your constraints and help bring the two parties together. Most of my job and most of what I do day to day is design solutions with people. And people are far more understanding. When someone comes to me that wants to do their blockchain, initiative, if I can sit down and I can get excited about technology. I love technology. You come and you've got a great idea, and that's going to impact students' lives. And what value is that going to bring to the institution? Oh, and you wrote a grant for what? Neat. Let's figure this out together. How can we make this work? Here's what I've got to work with. Here's what you want to do, and meeting in the middle. And sometimes that takes weeks of back and forth design work, months sometimes, just to get to a place where you're able to proceed and go forward. We don't get bogged down a lot with governance. It's more setting expectations up front and making everybody's goals known going into it. I always start the conversation with, my objective here is to make sure that the data that you're working with is safe, that you treat it in a manner that is not going to bring reputational or financial harm to the institution. Outside of that, I think we've got a lot of options to get from A to B here, and we can figure it out together. It might not be necessarily exactly, if you came to me already wanting an exact solution, that's not how we work. I like helping you solve problems, not don't bring your solutions to me, bring your problems, and we will solve them.
Okay. That's great. And speaking of problems, I'm assuming you guys have done what other universities have done and other companies even that are working on training programs and things like that, is you've updated or modernized some of your AV equipment and your classroom capabilities and things like that. Can you share with us maybe where you're thinking, education in multiple, they call it modalities, is going, and how that's going to impact you and your IT group specifically?
Oh, it's incredibly challenging. And it's not just challenging for IT. Everybody wants to complain, oh, well, IT's got to solve all these new things. No, the challenge is on all of our users having to change the way that they've had to do everything. So when we went online all of a sudden for the pandemic, We've got faculty members that have taught a course for 20, 30, 40 years that all of a sudden we told them they need to use Zoom, and they got to put their class in our LMS, and you need to do this all online. And that's a huge hurdle for those individuals. And we were all hands on deck. Everything that you could do to train and help through engagement and support, every one of those people have a successful experience, because if that faculty member doesn't have a successful experience, those 30 students in their class aren't going to have a good time. And are we going to be able to retain those students? If they have a suboptimal experience, it doesn't just affect their educational outcomes. At the end of the day, it will also affect our bottom dollar. If we can't retain the student and they're successful in their track and in their program, will they come back?
Okay. And where I was really headed though, Steve, was at the beginning of the pandemic, as a faculty member, we got a bunch of equipment in front of us, okay, much of which wasn't integrated. All right. Yeah. So even those of us who were tech savvy, working in the computer division of training, things like that, we're pushing buttons left and right. And it's funny sometimes when I look at Paul and he's talking, he's got the whiteboard behind him, and I go, a whiteboard, my goodness, how classic, I
love whiteboards.
Yeah, but I mean, where's your pen and tab and everything else that you need, in front of you? But regardless, so the equipment that was put in wasn't so integrated, was usable, but up front, I was the production AV producer, director, everything, pushing everything in different directions. What do you think is really going to happen? Are we going to start moving more towards integrated solutions, maybe doing teaching in studios instead of in front of, live audiences, combinations, hybrid? Are you guys looking at maybe doing anything like that?
Any course that isn't hybrid moving forward is not keeping up with the times. Students are going to expect access to the information for the hybrid course at a very minimum. In an LMS, you should be able to put the information your students need to know, like a syllabus, any ready at hand resources. You need to at least be able to have an information repository online, even if that's the bare minimum of what we call hybrid. Hybrid modalities of instruction, I do not believe that all institutions of higher ed are going to have to adopt them. And I tell you that because we see a big pull back toward traditional instruction, back toward the classrooms. The students want it. They want the face-to-face. They don't want to attend University of Phoenix. They want to attend a traditional four-year institution. They want to come to that class, feel like they know the professor, get to know each other as students. You don't get that in the Zoom room. You don't get that through a forum on an LMS. You only get it's just like a conference online. I miss going to conferences in person to talk to people like Oliver between sessions as much as attending any of these sessions. I miss that tremendously. And if we lose that, I feel like we'll lose a lot of the spirit of what higher ed is really here to perform.
You lose the serendipity, right?
Yes.
Serendipity.
That's not to say that technology won't have a role, but it is not the answer, and it is not where everything, in my opinion, is going to end up. Okay. We're not going to end up in a world where we're all, teaching through technology. And yes, I think that it is a great tool in the toolbox and weapon in the arsenal to have certain things be self-paced. Think about it like a training in the corporate world. You've got web-based training that's self-paced. You've got instructor-led training that's online, and then you've got instructor-led training actually in a room together.
Okay.
And people are going to fall on that spectrum, from the convenience of a la carte as you want it, all the way to the least convenient, it's in person, physically in a room, but each one of them brings something different to the table, and every student and their methodology, the way they learn, without getting into too many fancy educational terms, they're all different. They all want something different. Right. And different parts of these toolboxes can address different challenges for those kids.
Yeah, and I think where I was headed, Steve, was in the past, people use that methodology of, it's going to be self-study, it's going to be online, it's going to be, etc. But what we're seeing, at least from my perspective, is what you just said. All of the students have different learning modalities, and they all want it at the same time. So they want me to record the session. They want me to present it live over video so they can watch it in their dorm rooms. They want me to allow them to come to class so they can interact with each other, and all at the same time, you know. And so that's really the challenge here. It's not a problem before. It was, you know, you could do certain things. Now it's like I have to cater to all of these independent audiences.
Well, if a frog had wings, it wouldn't bump its butt.
Yep.
And I'll tell you that the kids can want a lot of things, and they're the customer. And ultimately, we're going to have to find that healthy mix.
Mm-hmm.
And they're also trying to figure out what they actually want. And what they say they want right now, I know we're running out of time, isn't necessarily what they're going to actually want. And when you put together all that work, and you as a faculty member put all that front load, let's say you gave them every one of those options, if you don't look back afterwards through the tools and technology that you've got to say, oh, well, no one actually downloaded the thing I recorded. Well, what did I do that for? You know, no one actually went and downloaded the notes that I stuck in the LMS either. You know, why did I bother with that? We're going to have to come up with a healthy mix, and it's not going to be the right answer for everybody. It's not the same fit for every school or every faculty member or every student. And I think that higher ed, we're going to have to redefine what our experience means and how we're trying to reach the students. And that's going to be a different thing for every place.
So reach out when you have that answer for me, because I need it. Anyway, I'll turn it back to Oliver here to sum it up if you'd like.
Yeah, thanks, Roman. So yeah, just quickly. So another fantastic conversation. So thank you, Steve. I think based on that performance, hopefully I'll get invited back for a fifth go at BIL-T. So, but no, thank you for your time and the insights and sharing, you know, your experiences in higher ed and the complexity therein. And I think, you know, ultimately, as I said at the start, there is multiple layers to this software, you know, complexity kind of piece. And I think we've scratched the surface on some of them. But for me, it's kind of what Steve said. It's if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, and you can't secure and risk, you know, assess it for risks and deal with the challenge when those risks become issues. So yeah, I mean, as always, if anyone wants to kind of reach out to me, find me on Architect Tomorrow, find me on LinkedIn, and I look forward to coming and doing more stuff with Iasa again in the near future. So thank you, Roman.